Breaking the spell. That MLM is permitted to operate with impunity due to political collusion and influence buying is a view many find unthinkable, unbearably negative. Individual corruption is comprehensible. Systemic, enduring, and bipartisan protection of an insidious global scam is beyond the purview of news. It would require a new vocabulary for reporting regulatory actions. To acknowledge the reality is to erode confidence in all government agencies. Institutional corruption will not be examined or acknowledged by the implicated institutions. As a perspective, it borders on conspiracy and provokes confusion and despair for many people. To break the spell of disinformation and to venture into this culturally unspeakable territory requires adopting, at least briefly, a perspective from another era. The adopted way of looking harkens to a time before government corruption was normalized as lobbying, special interests, and soft money, to an era when these were called boodle, graft, bribe, fix, and kickback. These plain and understandable terms have largely disappeared in modern coverage of campaign or electoral politics, concealing their effects. There is little investigation to explain exactly how the money affects the views, behavior, or fortunes of those in Congress who receive it, and there is no public discussion of standards of integrity or ethics of office holders. The role of money in politics is now treated like capital and revenue in business, a sort of fuel necessary for the process to function. Terminology that contrasts interests against the needs of the entire nation has been altered today to where virtually everyone is reduced to private membership in a respective and competitive interest group, pensioners and school teachers on par with pharmaceutical giants. The era and the perspective to be adopted for examining how MLM escapes law enforcement is that of muckraking journalism, reform, and good government movements at the beginning of the 1900s. The courage, perspective, and factual revelations of two crusading authors of that time, David Graham Phillips and Lincoln Steffens, offer guidance through today's baffling phenomenon of pyramid scams preying upon the public as legitimate income opportunities in full view of consumer protection agencies. To investigate and analyze corruption in the U.S. Senate in that seemingly long ago era, Cosmopolitan magazine in 1904 dispatched famed writer David Graham Phillips. His findings of more than 100 years ago eerily mirror our modern times. It turns out that many important things bearing on protection of the public interest have changed little. The Senate at that time was sometimes referred to as the, quote, the rich man's club. Phillips was a published novelist and well-known investigative journalist. His work is often credited with the passage of the 17th Amendment to the U.S. Constitution, which changed the method for choosing members of the U.S. Senate from smoke-filled state legislature selection to the statewide popular vote enjoyed today. Many of the targets of his Senate inquiries later resigned or were not reelected. His provocative work resulted indirectly in his early death, when a deranged person who believed a character in a Phillips novel was based on a member of his family murdered him at age 44. The Rich Man's Club is still with us, despite the passage of 100 years' time and the 17th Amendment. In a February 2018 article, The Wealth of Congress, published in the politically influential Roll Call newspaper, writer David Hawkins cited data showing the median net worth of Congress, half make more, half less, is 500% greater than the median net worth of the voters. In the introduction to Phillips' book, a collection of his investigative articles called The Treason of the Senate, the publisher offered some context for Phillips' work that is hauntingly current. It referenced data showing that, quote, 1% of the families living in the United States held more property than the remaining 99%. Based on its policies, attitudes, and actions, it concluded the Senate represented only the 1%. It asked rhetorically, who did not already know that a petition signed by 1 million of the common people would not have even half as much influence in the Senate as, quote, a mere nod of a Havermeyer, an Armour, or a Morgan, the rich and powerful of that day. Phillips examined how the corruption of the Senate related to this upside-down economic structure of America. How could it be, in a democracy, that the interest of the Armours and Morgans were put ahead of the public, and to what effect? Perhaps most relevant to understanding MLM influence buying, he probed the character and psychology of elected office holders and the many lower-level officials who facilitated the betrayal of public trust. In that era, taking money from special interests that harmed the public was viewed as treasonous. Phillips observed that the elected official representing interests while taking an oath to serve the public, quote, chooses to be comfortable, placed and honored, and a traitor to the oath and the people, rather than to be true to his oath and poor and ejected in private life. Phillips began his series of articles with a profile of the most famous New York lobbyist at the time, Chauncey Depew. In a revolving door pattern that is routine today, Depew moved from government office holder to paid lobbyist, working for Commodore Vanderbilt's railroad and financial empire, and then into public office as a U.S. Senator. As a senator, he was infamous as the protector and promoter of the interests of the Vanderbilts and Henry Hyde, founder of Equitable Life Insurance, the largest insurance company at that time. Phillips asserted that in an economy of concentration, with 99% having less than 1%, politics, quote, does not determine prosperity, but it does determine the distribution of prosperity. The Senate, he said, is the final arbiter of the sharing of prosperity. From that perspective, how would decriminalizing or legalizing pyramid schemes, which systematically transfer the wealth of millions of people to a tiny handful, be seen? By U.S. law, under the prevailing regulatory policy since 1980, perpetrating a pyramid scheme is effectively not a crime, just an unfair and deceptive business practice. By placing pyramid schemes under the FTC's jurisdiction, which cannot bring criminal cases, rather than the Department of Justice or the FBI, which can, Congress created a safe haven for MLM-style pyramids. In 1973, Walter Mondale, U.S. Senator from Minnesota and later Vice President to Jimmy Carter, put forth Senate Bill 1939. It defined the universal characteristics of MLM: payments to join, recruiting for rewards, and the promise of endless payments gained from purchases of recruits. It clearly distinguished pyramid purchasing from retail selling. Senator Mondale cited a letter from Minnesota's Attorney General that referred to the, quote, evils of pyramid sales distribution, and cited the need for a national law that would criminally outlaw them. In particular, he cited the recent FTC prosecution of the MLM Holiday Magic, which consumed 3 years of legal maneuverings by the FTC, leading only toward a civil settlement or actions. Mondale's bill stated, quote, "Whoever, in connection with the sale or distribution of goods, services, knowingly sells or offers or attempts to sell a participation or the right to participate in a pyramid sales scheme shall be fined not more than $10,000 or imprisoned for not more than 5 years, or both." The bill was never made into law, and from that point forward, the FTC took charge of almost all pyramid scheme law enforcement. Wrongdoing and financial harm of pyramid schemes were downgraded to mere civil complaints involving fines and promises to change without admission of guilt. Phillips presciently observed the early formation of an insular, amoral world of Washington politicians and lobbyists. That world is familiar to us today and has grown to include think tanks, politically connected law firms, and some universities and law schools. The members of these DC-based professions regularly switch roles like actors in a play. He noted their cynicism about corruption and how their sense of shame atrophied. In this mindset, he observed, these lobbyists and politicians viewed their service to special interests as a, quote, sort of patriotism. By adopting, at least temporarily, the sensibility and ideals reflected in Phillips' 1904 analysis, the influence of multi-level marketing on government, in which protecting MLMs from law enforcement is treated as a, quote, sort of patriotism, may be better understood. MLM's existential need from government is not in land, franchises, tax advantages, or government contracts, as the targets of Phillips' investigation notoriously were. To run its predatory and deceptive operations would require the organization of the world's first pyramid lobby, with its own offices in proximity to other large lobbies for banks, firearms, and casinos on infamous K Street in Washington, D.C. Its mission was clear: protection from fraud prosecution in the United States and, by political extension, the world. Its methods would be the same as those of other lobbies that seek undue favor from politicians and government officials, mainly by purchasing insider influence with campaign money, jobs, speaking fees, and lucrative connections to law firms and trade associations. Conversely, any officials that oppose the pyramid lobby would become targets of negative ads, adverse publicity, and labeled anti-business and enemies of the American dream.